In the modern mind, sleep is synonymous with sanctuary. We imagine pristine sheets, a deep breath of filtered air, and an uninterrupted journey into restorative darkness. It is an illusion we have carefully cultivated, a myth built on soap and scientific understanding. But if you could simply pluck back the velvet curtain of history and look upon how life was truly lived in those long-gone nights, that peaceful sanctuary would dissolve instantly into something far more unsettling, far stickier, and infinitely noisier. To romanticize medieval sleep is to commit a profound act of historical deceit. The notion of simply drifting off under the gentle cover of star-dusted linens suggests an organic purity that simply did not exist. In reality, the pursuit of rest was less a sublime ritual and more a reluctant truce negotiated with the accumulated filth of a densely packed pre-modern society. Consider the very bedding itself. It was rarely the crisp, bleached white cotton we take for granted today. Instead, it was often heavy, stained linen or wool materials that absorbed not just sweat, but the entire spectrum of domestic effluent. Spilled ale, greasy meals, unlaundered body oils, and the general grime accumulated from living in close quarters with thousands of other people breathing the same miasmatic air. The sheets were a receptacle. Every fold held residue. A man might settle into his pallet after a day spent in the chaotic mess of the marketplace, where discarded scraps, animal droppings, and the damp, earthy scent of sewage often formed an inseparable background perfume to life itself. And these smells, they settled, quite literally, into the fabric, becoming part of its very molecular structure. The concept of clean was not germ theory. It was ritualistic effort. Washing sheets required resources, time, water, and soap ingredients that were often themselves limited commodities. The truly wealthy could afford frequent changes, yes, but even their linen held the telltale signs of proximity to humanity's unavoidable messes. You were sleeping adjacent to life's inevitable detritus. And then there was the environment surrounding the bed itself. Medieval sleeping quarters were by no means climate-controlled havens. They were drafty, perpetually smoky rooms that served multiple purposes: a living space, a workspace, and frequently an appendage of the general waste management system. The very act of drawing breath in the dead of night meant inhaling the composite scent of stale smoke from tallow candles, wood smoke from hearth fires used for heating or cooking, animal musk emanating from unwashed garments, and that deep, pervasive aroma, unique to low-lying, perpetually damp urban areas. Every single corner held contamination. The floors were often packed earth or rough stone, frequently soiled by passing foot traffic. In the nearest privy, which was often a startlingly close companion piece in the architectural planning of any respectable household, the day's output was being dealt with, and its effluvium did not respect property lines or social class. To sleep was to accept an aromatic cocktail that ranged from stale urine to the sweet, cloying funk of fermenting garbage. This wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It affected digestion, respiration, and overall health in ways we can only dimly comprehend now. It necessitated a constant, exhausting vigilance simply to exist comfortably within your own dwelling. The linen itself became a social marker of relative cleanliness. The sheer accumulation of dirt on the expensive bedding was an embarrassment, often indicative not just of poverty, but of poor management and compromised living standards. A noble family could afford servants whose primary, and frankly gruesome, job included laundering vast quantities of fabric, attempting to remove the visible signs of yesterday's life from today's rest. The initial seductive narrative surrounding sleep, the idea that deep slumber grants spiritual renewal and physical perfection, was a carefully curated illusion. The reality was simply exhaustion piled upon the accumulated grime of survival. To dream was not just to escape. It was to attempt to process the day's unspeakable smells and sights while being covered in a mixture of human oils, textile residues, and general atmospheric pollutants. The sheets did not promise pristine rest. They merely promised temporary containment for the inescapable reality that you were sleeping deep within the heart of an intensely flawed, beautifully messy, utterly vulnerable civilization. The memory of clean sheets remains one of history's most persistent and lovely lies. We have learned to equate crisp white linen with purity, a soothing balm in the clamor of modern existence. But for those who slumbered centuries ago, such an illusion was tragically out of reach. Sleep, even when achieved, was never a gentle affair. It was an immersion into a visceral landscape of accumulated residue, and nowhere was this accumulation more obvious than in the realm of scent itself. We lived wrapped in our own biological effluvium, layered with the industrial detritus of unmanaged life. In the romantic imagination of modern viewers, sleep is a pristine escape, a clean drawer pulled shut on the day's filth. You imagine soft linens, cool air, and an uninterrupted darkness. But if you were to pull back the curtain on the medieval sleeper's bed, what you would find was not elegance, but infestation. Here, rest was not a luxury of the mind, but a fraught negotiation with biology itself. The moment we began investigating contamination sources, we realized that clean was less an aspiration and more a whispered myth. If previous chapters detailed the filth on your sheets, the spills, the effluent, the sheer general grime of existence, then this chapter pulls back the veil to reveal the unseen population that called these grimy slumbers their permanent residence. The blood-sucking Brigade. The medieval bed was not merely a surface for repose. It was an entire miniature ecosystem. It harbored mites whose habits we barely recognize today, swarms of lice, adapting to the human scalp like tiny, segmented landlords. These pests were not simply random nuisances. They were integrated members of the local economy and culture, a natural law that sheer willpower could not break. Their presence defined a certain state of being. The most notorious among these inhabitants, of course, are the bed bugs. They did not merely reside in the mattresses, they were intimately connected to the textiles themselves. These creatures viewed linen not as a barrier against the elements, but as an unparalleled feeding station and nursery. For them, every crevice, every fold, every seam of expensive velvet or coarse wool was potential real estate. The life cycle of these little invaders suggests a civilization entirely unprepared for microscopic warfare. From the delicate stuffing within a pillow to the deep folds of a curtain, they found purchase. They thrived in the warmth and relative stability that human habitation provided. Their droppings were often mistaken for mildew or simple stains. A stain on the bed, some thought, was simply proof that you had lived there enough. Consider the logistics. The bugs did not just appear at night, they established a full-time occupation. They fed on skin and blood, yes, but their existence required resources. Shed insect casings, accumulated waste products, the sticky remnants of spilled ointments. A bed was not cleared simply with vigorous airing out. It needed structural overhaul. The medieval understanding of infestation was often less scientific and more ritualistic. If the bugs were visible, they were dealt with through burning, an act that carried immediate risks to everything around them. Whole swaths of fabric would be incinerated in a desperate attempt at sanitation. Conversely, if the insects were microscopic or merely suspected, the methods leaned into deep cleansing rituals, washing, boiling, and excessive smoking. And it wasn't just the bed bugs doing the dirty work. The entire epidermal landscape was considered highly navigable real estate. Lice were omnipresent, their life cycle so entwined with human hair that they became almost symbiotic. Scabies, an itch derived from burrowing mites, similarly marked the body as both a point of vulnerability and a mark of social status, sometimes subtly displayed in courtly life, a sort of deeply embarrassing fashion statement you could never ignore. The reality was complex, far darker than any dramatic retelling might suggest. One lived not just with the odor of privy proximity or stale ale, but with an ever-present thrumming sense that one was being monitored, consumed, and processed by millions of uninvited, chitinous houseguests. Sleep, therefore, was less about rest and more about surviving another round of biological attrition. This pervasive level of infestation meant that the architecture of sleep, the bed itself, was constantly suspect. It could never truly be clean. The materials used to fight it were often counterproductive, generating their own risks, be they fire or chemical contamination. The desperate attempts at sanitation merely highlighted the profound depth of the problem. It was a relentless cycle. Use the linens, accumulate waste and pests, panic at the visible invasion, employ dangerous rituals like burning or excessive fumigating, only for the underlying reality, the vast population of microscopic life, to settle back into their established comfort zones, waiting patiently for the next night's feeding frenzy. To sleep in the medieval world was to accept a profound compromise. The temporary reprieve from waking consciousness in exchange for an uninterrupted dinner service delivered by nature's most persistent vermin. They were not mere pests. They were silent indicators of a vast systemic failure, reflecting a society that had conquered much of its environment, yet remained thoroughly subjugated to the basic realities of biological necessity and poor hygiene. The bed bug brigade, therefore, served as one of history's most persistent and most ignored footnotes on human vulnerability. Sleep, we often imagine it as a private ritual, an isolated chamber of rest where the body repairs itself in undisturbed darkness. We assume boundaries, quietude, and personal sanctuary. But when resources were scarce and communities clustered for survival, the very act of sleeping transformed from a solitary reprieve into a biological hazard zone. This chapter explores communal slumber, revealing that sharing a cot was not an exercise in intimacy or affection. It was, statistically speaking, a profoundly risky arrangement. In a world where germ theory remained utterly unknown and social distancing was a concept reserved for the academically curious, close quarters meant that every breath exhaled, every cough suppressed by sheer fatigue, was potentially pathogenic. If the individual cot represented a localized ecosystem of filth, a miniature swamp of sweat and detritus, then sharing it meant merging those swamps into one massive, highly efficient biohazard pool. The architectural reality of medieval living seldom afforded privacy. Sleeping quarters often doubled as living areas, workshops, and even stables in times of acute crisis. The proximity was inescapable. People lived stacked upon each other both vertically and horizontally. A family might share a single, low-ceilinged room where the scent profile constantly cycled between smoke, damp straw, unwashed bodies, and the lingering metallic tang of waste. Imagine the cumulative effect. Night after night, breathing in a cocktail of pollutants that never allowed any singular body to truly detoxify itself. The greatest hazard, however, was not merely the environment, but the people themselves. Human beings, when sleeping together in forced proximity, function as ideal conduits for contagion. Illnesses were viewed through the lens of miasma, the bad air, perhaps emanating from a nearby privy or an upset stomach. But the reality was far more intimate and shockingly physical. A simple cold carried by breath could mutate into something dreadful. Skin conditions that might seem minor today, like persistent itching or rash, could become catastrophic when multiplied across multiple individuals confined together. The transmission rates were staggering. What separated modern epidemics from medieval realities was the sheer lack of understanding regarding contagion vectors. They did not know to wash their hands. They did not understand viral load. And critically, they rarely had any concept of individual respiratory space. Every whispered secret, every rustle in the sheets, contributed to a shared cloud of airborne particulates. The consequences stretched far beyond mere discomfort or even seasonal outbreaks. Major plagues were often facilitated by these hyperdense living conditions. When entire families, guildsmen, and laborers slept side by side for economic necessity, they created optimal incubation hubs for anything that could be carried by the breath or transmitted through physical contact during wakeful hours. Consider the peasant sleeping in a crowded tenement building. The walls offered no reprieve from sound, smell, or disease. If one person developed a gastrointestinal ailment, the waste contamination was not localized. It seeped into the shared floor space, onto the meager bedding materials, and influenced the general air quality enough to upset the stomachs of their neighbors down the hall. The same pressure existed in the more privileged confines of the city, within guilds or barracks. While these quarters might be marginally cleaner than the poorest tenements, they still lacked the luxury of separation. Soldiers sleeping together, for instance, presented a perfect model of rapid contagion transfer. A single bout of dysentery could sweep through an entire cohort faster than any rumor could travel. The collective suffering meant that when illness struck, it often decimated multiple age groups and economic strata within the same confined space. There was no buffer zone, no fresh air intake system, and no quarantine protocols based on germ understanding. Survival became a matter of physical proximity to clean resources, a clear indicator of class stratification. The inability to truly isolate oneself meant that health was inherently communal. The recovery of one person necessitated the careful monitoring and relative separation of others, which was often economically impossible. Therefore, sleep itself ceased to be defined by restoration. It became a shared, collective endurance test against the relentless cycle of contamination and disease. We have spent considerable time charting the physical sources of contamination that plagued every night's rest, from the inevitable effluent near the privy walls to the persistent, tiny bites lurking in the fabric itself. Yet, we have often focused on the things we could see: the stains, the dampness, the creeping rot. But the filth was not just bacterial or fecal. It was deeply, fundamentally epidermal. It lived upon us, unnoticed, until it decided to bite its mark. To understand sleep in the medieval world, is to confront our own body's most persistent and embarrassing biological reality, the constant presence of parasites. We are dealing here with infestations so routine they had become an accepted part of courtly life, a silent testament to the lack of germ theory, personal privacy, or perhaps even sufficient bathing water. The aristocracy, in particular, developed a highly refined, if deeply uncomfortable, understanding of bodily flora and fauna. Lice and scabies were not merely inconveniences, they were social signifiers, markers etched onto the very skin that dictated your standing within the courtly hierarchy. The presence or absence, the severity of the irritation, spoke volumes about your station, your wealth, and frankly, how much you were willing to suffer for perceived refinement. The body was treated as a textile, constantly needing airing, scrubbing, or worse, burning. True noblewoman would not merely bathe. She would undergo elaborate rituals designed to eradicate visible signs of degradation, because those signs, the flaky residue, the telltale itching rash, the barely noticeable migration of insect life beneath the nail, were public disclosures. The discomfort was a commodity, often more discussed and even fetishized than actual perfumes. The scraping away of evidence became an elaborate form of personal performance. It required time, specialized tools, and above all, leisure commodities that, as we know, were incredibly scarce. Consider the social dynamic. One could be starving for days in the city streets, yet possess a fine, lightly powdered dressing gown and enough expensive oil to keep the worst of the itch at bay. The difference between the life-hardened peasant, whose skin bore the brunt of endless toil, and the courtier, whose primary battle was against the ephemeral signals of perceived uncleanliness, was often simply the accessibility of effective mitigation. The concept of clean shifted from a measure of sanitation to one of social performance. You weren't just trying not to smell bad, you were actively broadcasting an aura of non-biological threat. A person burdened by open, visible infestation was viewed as fundamentally poor, perhaps even spiritually compromised, undermining their very credibility at the feast or in council. The itch itself became a source of morbid entertainment. The gentle scratching, the need to scratch, it required constant physical management in public spaces. Imagine attempting to maintain a dignified conversation while simultaneously battling an unseen army beneath your fingernails. It was exhausting. It was humiliating. And yet, within these circles of intense formality, such visible vulnerability might ironically draw attention, forcing a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. The sheer physiological reality of scabies, the deep irritation, the papules, the intense nocturnal itching, was compounded by the close quarters of noble life. Sharing bathhouses, shared dressing rooms, and communal slumber areas ensured that the cycle of infestation was almost mathematically unavoidable. the very proximity that facilitated political alliance also guaranteed biological transfer. This led to a bizarre intersection of personal hygiene and courtly etiquette. Some attempts at remediation bordered on self-torture. To maintain a veneer of cleanliness meant resorting to substances ranging from sharp lye washes, which naturally stripped the skin barrier entirely bare, making it even more susceptible to poultices made of questionable herbal mixtures. The goal was never just health. It was aesthetic perfection achieved through painful deprivation. In this context, sleep became doubly problematic. It was not merely a period of unconscious rest. It was a time when the body's natural defenses were lowered, and the parasites, quite literally, got their prime real estate. The linen sheets, which we established were seldom pure, now had to contend with these tiny, flesh-eating tenants that thrived in the warm, humid conditions of bodies pressed together in too close an orbit. The narrative surrounding cleanliness, thus, became a deeply complex performance art. One was constantly managing the invisible burden carried on their skin and under their nails. The social cost of poor hygiene was not just reputation. It could literally mean exclusion from political power, or worse, sickness that led to death. It elevated epidermal health to the level of military readiness. The constant battle with these intimate, unavoidable parasites forced a preoccupation with the superficial, distracting enough the ruling class from truly confronting the systemic environmental failures surrounding them. They worried about who had itchy fingers while ignoring the open sewer just 10 yards away. The sheer effort required to maintain the appearance of immaculate rest became a hallmark of high society, creating an elegant but deeply compromised standard of living. It reminds us that in the medieval world, being clean was not simply preventing disease. It was mastering a complex system of public presentation, where every visible scratch or unexplained rash whispered accusations about your virtue, your family's fortune, and your ultimate right to participate in the exhausting, uncomfortable spectacle of courtly life. And so, as we continue our journey through these forgotten corners of human survival, remember that even the quiet act of sleeping was nothing short of a grueling, unsanitary negotiation with one's own flesh, and the microscopic tenants who paid rent with their bite. We have examined the pervasive filth that accompanied a night's rest, from the shedding skins of lice to the ceaseless, creeping presence of bed bugs. We understood that true cleanliness was not merely an absence of visible dirt, but a massive economic and infrastructural failure. But even accepting this persistent level of biological decay did nothing to solve the fundamental problem. How do you sanitize a life lived so closely with filth? The sheer volume of organic matter, both living and dead, pressing against the walls of your sleeping chamber, demanded some kind of radical intervention. And when facing overwhelming contamination, humanity's response is often magnificent in its desperation and terrifying in its carelessness. In this era, cleaning was not an act of hygiene. It was a monumental gamble with flammable materials. We moved beyond washing the linen, which perpetually came back stained and riddled with miniature biological time capsules, and started contemplating the very structure of the room itself. The air itself became suspect, perceived as heavy and tainted by miasma, a breath corrupted by proximity to waste and sweat. Therefore, if the contaminants were too pervasive for simple laundering or insecticidal soap, which was, by the way, non-existent, the solution lay in extremes, heat and smoke. The emerging practice of cleansing was nothing less than an act of controlled incineration. Imagine entering a room that has been treated not as a dwelling, but as a massive botanical specimen requiring rigorous seasonal preservation. You were to strip everything away, eliminating every piece of fabric, every questionable curtain, even the structural components, deemed too porous to withstand the onslaught of filth. The core belief driving these desperate measures was simple. If it could burn, it must be cleansable. And if it could be cleansed with fire, then any surviving contamination, be it an ancient itch or a persistent stain, must flee its molecular structure. This led to rituals that today appear both theatrical and homicidally ill-advised. We speak of rooms deliberately filled with smoke, not merely for aroma, but as a physical agent of sanitation. Herbs were burned until the air tasted like desperation and char. Woods were stacked, scented capresmic materials, anything dry enough to provide robust plumes of smoke, were lit in an effort to scrub the atmosphere clean. The goal was absolute fumigation, a process intended to kill airborne spores, extinguish lingering miasmas, and presumably scour invisible insect eggs from plaster and timber alike. But fire, by its very nature, is inefficient when wielded as a primary cleaning tool. It consumes indiscriminately. These methods offered little distinction between the pathogen you were attempting to eradicate and the irreplaceable artifact that happened to be leaning against the wall. A beloved wooden chair, bearing the marks of centuries of life and comfort, might be subjected to a fierce blast of smoke until its varnish blistered and cracked, or worse, deemed too flammable and sacrificed entirely to the purifying flames. The unfortunate fate of certain furniture pieces is particularly illustrative. If a cabinet was stained beyond repair by spilled ale, or if a mattress frame seemed inexplicably attractive to vermin, it wasn't simply discarded, it was often roasted. Imagine the process, placing solid wooden objects into intense heat until they warped and blackened, hoping that the residual smoke would somehow permeate their core structure, killing anything latent within the grain. This practice is not merely inconvenient, It fundamentally challenges the very concept of material permanence in a medieval setting. The sheer danger inherent in this entire ritual cannot be overstated. These fire hazards were often performed during the darkest hours, fueled by desperation, and sometimes compounded by intoxication or sheer exhaustion. One errant ember, one improperly cooled brazier, one gust of unmanaged wind, and weeks of carefully accumulated, hard-won civilization could simply vanish in a terrifying instant of smoke and flame. The resulting architectural paranoia led to an increasingly defensive approach to domestic architecture. People began building not just for habitation, but for containment. Doors were fortified, windows were kept tightly shuttered against the perceived infiltration of bad air, and storage was designed with more interlocking security than basic structural integrity suggested. It became a continual balancing act, maintaining a respectable appearance of cleanliness while living in an environment that was intrinsically geared towards decomposition and infestation. These were not measured efforts. They were reactive, panicked responses to contamination so profound it threatened not just the occupants' health, but their very sense of physical security. This reliance on destructive purifying fire meant that every attempt at hygienic restoration carried a massive systemic risk. We are talking about an average domestic life where the nightly threat wasn't just illness or pests, but potential conflagration triggered by an overly enthusiastic burning incense stick or an improperly stored pile of smoky herbs. The sheer physical and psychological toll this took on the population is immense. To live in a state of perpetual quasi-emergency, always preparing for the next plume of smoke to consume your meager belongings, must have been exhausting. It shaped their sense of time, their relationship with material objects, and ultimately, their definition of rest. Sleep was not an act of passive recuperation. It was a tense, precarious negotiation between biological decay and sudden immolation. We learned to fear the pyre as much as we feared the plague miasma, because both promised total annihilation, one slow and insidious, the other swift and spectacular. This deep-seated, flammable anxiety became interwoven with every facet of their existence, transforming the humble sleeping quarters into a volatile mixture of stored memories, accumulating waste, biological threats, and combustible desperation. It is perhaps easier to understand then why scenting failed. It was simply too much effort when you lived perpetually one bad night's smoke away from utter ruin after spending time contemplating the microscopic horrors teeming upon our linens, and beneath our nails, the bed bugs, the lice, the constant parade of skin afflictions. It is perhaps natural that we next turn our attention to the ground beneath us, or rather, what was often immediately adjacent to it. Because for true medieval sleep, hygiene was not just a matter of breathable air or clean fabric. It was fundamentally dictated by the proximity to the daily effluent of human existence. Consider the architectural reality. In most urban centers, there was no separation between life and disposal. The privy, the latrine, the place where humanity shed its physical waste, often shared immediate boundaries with the sleeping quarters. To simply exist meant cohabiting with decay. Our understanding of sanitation, if we can call it that, was laughably primitive by modern standards, making the concept of a genuinely sanitary nightly slumber an almost mythical pursuit. The air itself became saturated not only with sweat and the sweet musk of stale perfume, but with the volatile bouquet of human waste. Imagine lying down after a long day, a day of political maneuvering, artisanal labor, or simply poor digestion, knowing that your deepest breaths were inhaling the miasma rising from structures barely meters away. This wasn't just an unpleasant odor. It was a potent cocktail of ammonia, methane, and the inescapable funk of civilization's waste stream. When every surface, including your mattress, was subject to this perpetual atmospheric pollutant, the natural cycle of rest was irrevocably compromised. This reality did not merely affect our nostrils, it settled deep within the biology of sleep itself. We are inherently sensitive to air quality, and medieval night air, a mix of smoke from burning herbs, stale ale fumes, lingering body odors, and the ever-present seepage of human waste, was a perfect storm for respiratory distress and general malaise. The chemical imbalance was constant, turning simple rest into an act of biological endurance against environmental toxicity. The relationship between sleeping life and refuse disposal is one of inescapable contamination. There was no modern understanding of plumbing or effluent separation. Waste water and sewage often ran through the same channels that fed into drinking sources. This meant that the very system designed to remove waste ultimately circled back around, contaminating every aspect of existence, including the supposed sanctuary of the bed. Sleep, in this environment, became a delicate negotiation with perpetual filth. It was less about peaceful repose and more about merely surviving another cycle of environmental assault. Our bodies were constantly fighting off airborne pathogens carried by contaminated air, while our lungs worked overtime to filter out particulate matter, soot from cooking fires, mixing freely with the airborne acids generated by decomposing material. The very act of drawing a deep breath in the pre-germ theory world was an investment in systemic contamination. And this brings us to the perverse rituals surrounding cleanup. Since the entire environment was understood as inherently soiled, the efforts to clean were magnificent, elaborate, and tragically misguided. We saw people attempting grand fumigations, burning scented woods, piling aromatic herbs into massive smoldering pyres, inside poorly ventilated rooms, or even scorching sections of fabric in a desperate attempt to neutralize invisible foulnesses. The intention was noble, to purify the air and deter unseen contagions. But these methods often resulted in an immediate, equally potent secondary problem: acute smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide poisoning, and massive fire risk. In an era where wood was fuel for cooking, heat, and both life and death, this obsession with purity was a lethal domestic hazard. The contamination wasn't just chemical or atmospheric, it was particulate. Consider the residue left behind. When coal fires fueled the city, they coated everything: the linens, the wooden furniture, the flesh of the sleeper, in fine layers of sooty grime. And when coupled with human effluent aerosols and the ever-present dust kicked up by workers moving through waste runoff, the accumulation was profound. Every corner of life became a receptacle for settled biological filth. This systemic failure in infrastructure meant that clean had lost its definition. It wasn't merely about washing linens or soaping skin. It required a massive civic overhaul, a mastery of hydrology, and waste removal far beyond the capabilities of medieval engineering. Because such systems did not exist, one was forever tethered to the smell, the sight, and the biological reality of concentrated human habitation. Sleep, therefore, became fundamentally compromised. It wasn't a respite from the day. It was merely another segment of time spent immersed in an inescapable ecosystem of filth, decay, and perpetually proximate waste. The best intentions of scented candles or expensive linens could only mask the deeper stench emanating from the adjacent cesspit, reminding us that even unconsciousness offered no reliable immunity from the pervasive stink of a pre-modern city. The fundamental truth of medieval sleep was this: it was dictated entirely by your purse. Your station in life, the very quality of your rest, hung on the weight of gold and the sheen of imported dyes. We had spent chapters examining the microbial assault, the omnipresent pests, and the toxic atmosphere saturated with human effluent. But before we delve into the biological nightmare, we must first address the socioeconomic stratification of slumber itself. Consider the stark divide between the nobleman's bedchamber and the peasant's hut. One world whispered of luxury, the other smelled faintly and perpetually of wood smoke and despair. For the landed elite, sleep was not merely a biological necessity. It was a commodity, a visible signifier of wealth that could be displayed even in darkness. And this meant an almost hysterical obsession with materials. The peasant lived on what was immediately available: rough-spun wool, patched linen salvaged from generations past, perhaps some serviceable animal hide if they were particularly lucky. These sheets breathed the odors of poverty and damp earth. The soil clung to them. The grease of simple sustenance permeated their fibers. Their sleep was visceral, demanding nothing more than basic survival in a filthy pocket of breathable air. Contrast this with the great lords and ladies, whose bedrooms were sprawling architectural statements designed to convey power. Here, the materials ascended beyond utility and entered the realm of ostentatious declaration. Silk, damask, velvet, these fabrics arrived via arduous trade routes from distant lands, weaving a complex tapestry of status into every fiber. These sheets were masterpieces of consumption. They did not merely facilitate rest, they catalogued one's lineage and market access. Now, let us talk about the practical reality of silk on a nightly basis. Imagine sleeping wrapped in something so fine it feels like solidified moonlight. It sounds sublime, doesn't it? The sheer coolness against the overheated skin, the whispered whisper of its fibers when one moves. But this luxury came with profound drawbacks, far exceeding mere dirtiness. Silk is beautiful, yes, but it was also structurally different from linen or wool. It did not absorb sweat and body oils in the way natural plant fibers do. Rather, it allowed them to sit on top. And what accumulates over a lifetime of high society slumber? A unique blend of expensive cosmetics, rich bodily secretions, stale wine spilled during late-night revelry, and certainly the accumulated excrement of every passing night pest. The resulting patina was not the clean musk of French soap. It was an aristocratic miasma. The sheer cost also meant that these linens were kept for decades. They passed through generations, accumulating not just stains, but historical layers of dirt and oil. The cycle of cleaning became impossible to maintain on such magnificent goods. To wash them properly would require industrial quantities of costly lye soap and enormous amounts of freshwater resources available only to the wealthiest households, which also meant that washing was often an event involving dozens of servants, further introducing human contamination. Dirty secret here is twofold. Not only were these luxury linens dirtier than they appeared, but their very existence created a unique kind of cleanliness problem. The attempt to maintain perfection became its own form of pollution. For the aristocracy, sleep was an endless performance of immaculate upkeep. They could afford the finest laundresses and the most potent perfumes, which only compounded the underlying funk. Their lives were a constant negotiation with appearance. You didn't just have to be clean, you had to look clean, even if your biological reality suggested otherwise. This pressure was exhausting. Consider the thread count of life itself, dictated by who could afford it. The linen of the poor, while grungy and desperate, at least had a functional simplicity. It endured. The silks of the rich, however fragile, were prone to elaborate stains, wine splashes that spoke of raucous galas, or pigments from expensive dyes that stained beyond recognition. The physical objects of sleep thus became microcosms of social power. A tarnished, worn-out blanket suggested genteel poverty. A spotless bolt of woven damask signaled deep, unquestionable wealth. The linens literally painted the social map of the bedroom floor. This brings us to an inescapable truth. Material luxury does not equate to hygienic superiority. In fact, it often heightened the problem by creating highly elaborate surfaces that accumulated grime with almost defiant splendor. You could have the most beautiful sheets in the known world, woven from threads kissed by exotic breezes and dyed with painstaking effort. Yet they were still resting on a mattress filled with dust mites, harboring bed bugs, and sitting near a privy that promised nighttime ammonia floods. The wealthy sleep was merely pollution displayed elegantly. It was dirt viewed through the expensive filter of status. The great failure was not in the materials, but in the fundamental lack of infrastructure, a reality that transcended mere economic class. From the nobleman's velvet curtain to the serf's threadbare shawl, the biological truth remained. Sleep itself was a transaction with filth, and no amount of silk or incense could void that contract. It is perhaps the most comforting thought that sleep is a purely natural act, a brief surrender to unconsciousness. We imagine it as a gentle, restorative ritual, unburdened by the harsh realities of the waking world. Yet, for those living in the medieval period, the very concept of rest was fraught with invisible danger. The filth and decay we had discussed up until now, the stench from the privies, the chitinous remnants left by the bed bugs, the sticky residues of peasant sweat mixed with wine spills, these were merely physical contaminants. To truly understand how difficult a simple night's sleep was, one must journey into the realm of belief itself. In an era before germ theory, when medicine struggled to explain anything beyond bleeding and prayer, unexplained illness could not be biological. It had to be spiritual. When a fever struck or a cough racked the body in the deepest hours of the night, the immediate human response was not always empirical observation. Often it was fear, a profound and primal terror directed toward forces unseen. And what were these invisible forces? They manifested as miasmas, but on a far grander scale than merely bad odors. These were bad airs, believed to be noxious vapors exuded by planetary alignments, angry spirits, or simply the accumulated malevolence of too many poorly managed lives crammed into one wooden structure. The poor air, therefore, became synonymous with spiritual pollution. The air itself was treated as a physical contaminant, just as much as the soiled linen. If your bed lay near a cesspit, that proximity wasn't just an inconvenience. It was evidence of spiritual decay infecting your sleep. The smell of ammonia from the Privy washroom wasn't merely regrettable. It was proof that you were sleeping under a curse. This inability to categorize illness and contamination led to what we might call sleep witchcraft. Because physical sickness was so often accompanied by confusing symptoms, dizziness, sleepless hallucinations, sudden chills, people began to suspect influences from the supernatural. The subtle aches of scabies could be mistaken for demonic torments. A persistent rash, perhaps a simple allergic reaction to damp woolen sheets, could be declared proof of having slept under an angry gaze. The boundaries between natural misfortune and malice were alarmingly porous. If one simply had a bad dream, it wasn't attributed to the passing fumes of human waste that night. No, it was believed to be the whispering of vengeful spirits who mistook your repose for weakness. The deepest sleep was therefore not viewed as a time of restoration, but rather as a moment of extreme vulnerability, a gaping hole in the body's spiritual defenses. The implications were devastatingly complex. To maintain good health and achieve deep sleep required more than just clean sheets. It demanded ritualistic protection against unseen enemies. People sought elaborate methods to cleanse not only their linens, but the air around them, believing that purifying the space would purify the soul's connection to rest. These protective rituals took various forms across medieval life. Some believed in specific wards, symbols drawn on the lintel or tucked under the mattress that could repel malicious energies. Others relied heavily on apotropaic charms, amulets of iron, blessed salt, or dried herbs that were thought to confuse malevolent spirits with their pungent odors and rustic physicality. The greatest fear was not just sleeping dirty, but falling victim to a sleep actively interrupted by negative forces. Insomnia became less a symptom of anxiety and more evidence of an attack. If you couldn't find peace in your bed, it meant something unseen was fighting for occupancy. This merging of the physical reality, the actual lice bites, the perpetual dampness, the methane gas, with the abstract terror of spiritual contamination, created a life under constant psychological strain. Sleep itself became an act of negotiation with forces, both chemical and mystical. You were not just contending with bed bugs, you were contending with bad air, restless demons, and the deep, unsettling suspicion that your very breath might be contaminated by something more terrible than waste. The effort required to achieve a single night of truly peaceful rest was enormous, an exhausting combination of meticulous cleaning rituals, constant vigilance against pests, careful management of visible social decay, and perhaps most tiringly, navigating the ever-present fear of spiritual surveillance. It is this belief in invisible contagions that adds a layer of profound, cosmic disgust to the physical filth. It tells us that even when your sheets were momentarily free of lice dust and human effluent, you were still sleeping under the shadow of a suspected curse. And for medieval man, the taint of a suspicion was often far worse than the stench itself. The pre-germ world saw contamination as a spiritual failure first, and a biological 1 second. It was a dizzying, deeply uncomfortable tapestry woven from damp wood, human excrement, gnats, and nothing at all. We have spent this journey tracing the depths of historical uncleanliness. We have endured the suffocating miasmas of Privy proximity, catalogued the ceaseless twitching legs from bed bug invasions, and witnessed how status and scented linen could barely mask the fundamental truth that medieval sleep was a profound compromise. It was not rest, it was merely an endurance. But what happens when we finally emerge from this swamp of history, confronting the myth of our own modern repose? We must first confront a deeper,